Priests and lay worshippers in Ethiopia are on a mission to replicate or even recreate centuries-old religious manuscripts and sacred artwork in efforts to preserve traditions and heritage.
On the grounds of the Catholic University of America in Washington, Ethiopian religious manuscripts are coming to life.
For 1,600 years, a monastery on an Ethiopian plateau has guarded a Bible the Western world was never allowed to read. 88 books, not 66, and pages so faded even the monks stopped being able to read them. Then Oxford pointed an AI at those pages. The ink came back. The words resolved on screen, and inside the silence that followed, scholars realized they were reading something specific, something Jesus did during the 40 days between the empty tomb and the ascension, something that was deliberately kept out of every Bible you have ever opened. You need to see what it was. The Forbidden Archive. Here is what you have to understand about what Mercier was looking at. It was a page from the Garma Gospels. Goatskin, more than an inch thick, created somewhere between 330 and 650 CE inside a monastery in the Ethiopian highlands, which makes it possibly the oldest complete illuminated Christian manuscript in existence. Older than Rome's preserved canon, older than the Syrian texts, older than almost anything the Western Church has ever pointed to as foundational. That page sits inside a Bible the Western world has never read. 88 books, not 66. 22 sacred texts the rest of us have never been allowed near, hand-copied in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, on parchment so thick you can feel the animal under your thumb. And here is what nobody tells you. For almost 16 centuries, large sections of those manuscripts have been invisible. Not missing, invisible. The ink had faded below what human eyes can see, and the monks of Abba Garima kept venerating the pages anyway, because they had no way of knowing what was still inside them and what had been lost forever. Stay with me, because this is where the story flips. When Oxford University brought in multispectral imaging software and AI-assisted Ge'ez linguistic analysis, the tools did not just confirm the age of the manuscripts.
When you start looking at the yellow pigments, and that's one that hasn't survived well in the Chad Gospels. So to be able to recover that with recovery techniques actually after doing the multispectral imaging, you can see the dynamics of the pages in more profound ways.
They surface text, specific words, whole passages that had not been legible since the 7th century, and the scholars in the room went quiet because those passages were not liturgy, they were not scribal corrections. They were words attributed directly to Jesus during a very specific window, the 40 days after he walked out of the tomb. What the machine read first was not what anyone expected to find. What the machine read first. Here is how it actually worked. Multispectral imaging lights the parchment at wavelengths far beyond visible light, near infrared, ultraviolet. At those frequencies, ink that looks identical to surrounding parchment under a normal lamp suddenly separates. Carbon ink absorbs differently than aged goatskin. The machine sees the difference. The machine reconstructs the letters your eyes cannot.
I can have damaged text, and I can tell you what it, or if I'm lucky, I can tell you actually what it says. So the multispectral imaging is just highly significant for that reason, for that recovery.
Then, a Ge'ez linguistic AI goes to work. It cross-references every reconstructed character against a database of thousands of known Ge'ez texts. The full Ethiopian biblical canon, church documents, centuries of monastery records. It picks the most statistically probable reading of every ambiguous letter. When its confidence clears the threshold, the passage is flagged as legible. Here is what that actually means. Most of what the AI flagged in the Garma Gospels had never been transcribed, not once, in 1,600 years. And get this, in some sections there was no ink left to read, none. The software was working from physical depressions in the parchment fiber, tiny grooves left by the original reed stylus. Long after the ink that once filled them had disappeared completely, the text was gone. The ghost of the hand that wrote it was still there. The machine could read the ghost. When the first flag passages were translated, they landed in a specific zone of the manuscripts. Scholars call it post-resurrection dialogue, the window between the empty tomb and the ascension, 40 days. In the version of the Bible you have read, that window barely exists. A handful of verses, and then he is gone. In the Ethiopian texts, it is the most important teaching period in human history, because Jesus, during those 40 days, was no longer constrained by the political realities that had shaped everything he had said in public until then. Here is what nobody is telling you about what he said during those 40 days. The 40 days nobody talks about. He did not bless. He did not comfort. He did not tell stories about seeds and soil. He warned. According to the Ethiopian texts, specifically the Book of the Covenant and the Didascalia, cross-referenced now against the newly legible Garma passages, Jesus spent the 40 days after the resurrection predicting, in surgical detail, what would happen to his message once powerful institutions got their hands on it. He warned that people would one day shout his name from every rooftop while ignoring everything he actually taught. He warned that they would build structures of breathtaking scale and call them houses of God, while the human soul, which he called the only real temple, went uncultivated. He warned that religious leaders would weaponize his name for money, for power, and for the kind of social control that looks like faith from the outside and functions like a prison from the inside. And then he named something. He named a condition. He called it the walking death, when your heart is beating but your soul is asleep. Read that phrase again, the walking death. Now look at the world around you. Endless scrolling, compulsive consumption, social connection at a scale no generation has ever known, paired with loneliness at a depth no generation has ever recorded. People surrounded by more information than any human being in history has had access to, somehow less certain of what is true than at any point in the last 5 centuries. Jesus named that condition 2,000 years ago, and a machine just helped us read the name clearly for the first time. If you just felt a chill when he described the walking death, subscribe now. Because what the machine read next is specifically about who he warned you to stay away from, and the people he described by behavior, not by name, are alive today. They are on your feeds. They run organizations you have donated to. Subscribe. You need to see the rest. Back to the 40 days. Because there is another warning in those reconstructed passages, and it is not vague. It is not spiritual caution. It is a direct instruction. Jesus identified false religious leaders, not theologically, behaviorally. He described people who appear holy, who speak like saints, who gather followers through the language of devotion, and who systematically harm the most vulnerable people in their care. And then he did something specific. He instructed his followers to stay away from such leaders entirely. No qualification, no process of discernment, away. He said, real holiness is not ornate robes. It is not performative prayer. It is compassion, honesty, service rendered without an audience. And he said anyone who demands an audience for their holiness has already told you everything you need to know about them. These are the exact passages that were cut from the Western Bible. Not corrupted over time, not lost in translation, cut. The institutional church had centuries to look at the Ethiopian canon and chose every time not to integrate it. And what the AI has read so far is only one thread. The bigger thing it found was hiding in the connections between the manuscripts. And that is where this stops being a story about one hidden passage and starts being a story about an entire lost version of Christianity. The canon. They kept... Here is what nobody tells you. The Garma passages are not an outlier. They are one node in a system. You already know the Book of Enoch, complete survival only in Ethiopia. Book of Jude in the New Testament nearly quotes it word for word. James Bruce carries copies back to Europe in the 1770s. The 1821 English translation sets off the same academic firestorm the Dead Sea Scrolls would later produce. That part is already famous. Here is the part that is not. When the multispectral imaging was applied beyond the Garma Gospels to the rest of the Abba Garma holdings.
The applications of multispectral imaging for the British Library include recovering erased and faded text, recovering information that has been lost due to damage over time, water damage, fire damage, anywhere where there's text that has become illegible over time.
The AI started flagging something nobody had asked it to look for. cross-references, linguistic bridges between the Book of Enoch, the Book of the Covenant, the Didascalia, and the newly legible Garma passages. The software ran the probability check on those bridges and marked them as statistically non-random, in plain English. These texts were written by people who knew each other's work. Stay with me, because this is the moment the story changes. When the scholars asked the AI to map those connections visually, what came back was not a list. It was a web, a deliberate, internally consistent, cross-referencing theological architecture. The monks of Abba Garma had not just been preserving individual books. They had been guarding a living system of thought, designed to be read together. The Western canon, by removing 22 of the 88, had not edited that system. It had broken it, and the broken-off pieces describe things that are not in the 66-book Bible at all. Here is what that actually means. Some of the newly legible Garma text describes a cosmology of two creative forces. One generates true light. The other creates shadow and form without genuine spirit. A prideful secondary creator who built a world of apparent beauty but no real soul, who declared itself the only God while something greater existed above it, unacknowledged. Jesus in these passages describes his mission not just as atonement, but as an awakening from a specific illusion, the illusion that the shadow world is all there is. That is not Sunday school. That is not anywhere in the canon you were handed. And it has been sitting in the Ethiopian highlands, fading into parchment, waiting for a machine that could see light your eyes cannot see. The passages keep going. Every thought carries spiritual weight. Every emotion is either pulling your soul toward light or dragging it toward darkness. The kingdom of God is not a location. It lives inside you. Every genuine act of kindness, every real moment of forgiveness, every expression of sincere love activates what the texts describe as divine light, present in everything. The prayer described in these texts is nothing like the Western model. It is not spoken petition addressed to a distant deity. It is breath, movement, and silence. A whole-body practice that aligns body, mind, and spirit into a single act of attention. The contemplative traditions the Western Church spent centuries dismissing as fringe or heretical turnout, according to these manuscripts, to be central to what Jesus actually taught, the original version, the one that existed before any council convened to decide which version of Jesus the world was going to be allowed to see. So, the obvious question is, how did Ethiopia keep all of this when Rome did not? The answer is carved into solid rock, and some of it is still bleeding history. How they survived. To understand why Ethiopia preserved what Rome removed, you have to stand in front of 11 churches that are not built on the earth. They are carved down into it. 12th century. King Lalibela has a vision. Muslim conquests have closed the overland pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem. His response is not to find another route. His response is to build a new Jerusalem inside the highland rock itself. 24 years of work. Trenches cut deep into the volcanic stone. Enormous monolithic blocks shaped, then hollowed out into complete churches. Pillars, windows, doors, arches, full interiors. Every one of them carved from a single continuous piece of rock. Some stand freely inside their own pits. Others connect through tunnels, so narrow pilgrims turn their candles sideways to pass. The most famous, Beit Georgis, the Church of St. George, is carved in the shape of a perfect cross, 15 meters deep, visible from above as a geometric impossibility. UNESCO puts them next to the pyramids of Egypt and the Great Wall of China. More than 100,000 pilgrims arrive on foot every year, in white robes, carrying candles. This is not tourism. This is a living faith, operating without interruption since the 12th century. Here is the part that matters for the manuscripts. Ethiopia was never fully colonized. The Battle of Adwa in 1896 ended Italian ambitions permanently. One of the most decisive defeats of a European colonial force in African history. Language, faith, and sacred texts all stayed out of reach of outside institutions. While the Roman Church was deciding which books the faithful would be allowed to read, Ethiopia kept all of them, not as rebellion, as stewardship. The Abba Garima monastery survived Muslim incursions in the 1530s. Italian troops fought nearby in 1896. Fires damaged the complex in the early 20th century. The manuscripts came through every single one of those events, passed from monk to monk under one non-negotiable rule. Their job was not to decide what was true. Their job was to preserve it intact for whoever came next. God's truth is not ours to judge. It is ours to guard. Every page, every faded line, every passage too degraded for human eyes to read, kept, honored, passed on, in the faith that one day somebody would find a way to read it again. That day arrived, and the machine they used was pointed at a monastery that believes it is also guarding something else entirely. The Ark and the Guardian. Many Ethiopians believe the original Ark of the Covenant, the one Moses built, is inside a single chapel in the city of Axum. Not a replica, the original, guarded by one monk. He dedicates his entire life to that single duty. He speaks to no one. He is replaced only when he is dying. The theological basis is spelled out in the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's national epic. It states that Menelik I, the son of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, returned from Jerusalem carrying the real Ark and left a copy behind in Solomon's temple. Haile Selassie, who ruled Ethiopia until 1974, was believed to be the 225th monarch of that same Solomonic line. 225 generations. That is not folklore decoration. That is a cultural identity sustained for 3,000 years. Now ask yourself something. If the Ethiopian church genuinely believed it was guarding the Ark of the Covenant, how do you think it treated the manuscripts that explained what the Ark was for? Exactly. They were not stored like books. They were protected like sacred objects. Because to the monks of Abba Garma, that is what they were. Every January 19th, when Timkat arrives, the Ethiopian Epiphany, you can watch what that belief looks like in physical form. Hundreds of thousands in brilliant white robes, priests carrying tabots, sacred replicas of the Ark, through the streets to rivers and specially prepared baptismal pools. At sunrise, the water is blessed. Choirs sing in Ge'ez, incense fills the highland air. Thousands fully immerse themselves, renewing their baptismal promises. A chain of belief unbroken for nearly 1,500 years, performed in the open, in front of anyone willing to watch. These are not people performing a tradition they barely understand. They are living inside a theological system that has never been interrupted, a form of Christianity older than almost everything the Western world treats as foundational and more complete than anything in the 66-book canon. And for 1,600 years, a machine capable of reading it did not exist. Until it did. And until that moment arrived, in a quiet room in front of Jacques Mercier and an Oxford lead researcher who would not speak for 2 minutes, nobody alive knew what the monks had actually been guarding. The room when it happened, back to that room, because this is where everything lands. Jacques Mercier is French. He spent years embedded with the monks at Abba Garima. He earned their trust. He is the one who carried physical copies of the Garma Gospels' most critical pages out of Ethiopia for analysis. He knew exactly what he had. He also knew the radiocarbon dating and the AI reconstruction together were about to produce something that had never happened before in the history of Christian scholarship. The Oxford lead researcher has spent years with ancient manuscripts. He is, by reputation, not a dramatic man. When the Ge'ez text resolves on the screen and the confidence interval clears the threshold and the words become readable for the first time in 16 centuries, he steps back from the monitor. And he does not speak for nearly 2 minutes. Another team member says later that she looked around the room at that moment and realized every single person had stopped moving. Nobody had announced anything. The silence was involuntary, a collective physical response to the realization that something was being seen by human eyes for the first time in more than a millennium. One researcher later described it in a single sentence. We were not ready for what it said. What they were reading was a Jesus who warned, specifically and in detail, about the exact corruptions that would define institutional religion for the next 2,000 years. A Jesus who called out false leaders by behavior, not by name, because the behavior is always the same. Appearance of holiness, systematic harm of the vulnerable, weaponization of faith for power and money. He identified the condition. He named the void that people would try to fill with consumption and distraction. He predicted that his own message would be used to deepen that void once institutions got hold of it. And then he said the antidote. It is not a new institution. It is not a bigger building. It is not a more powerful leader. It is not a more rigorous orthodoxy. It is something that lives inside every single person who chooses, in a specific moment, love over convenience, truth over comfort, service over performance. That message was not useful to the institutions that would later claim his name, so it was cut. While Ethiopia kept reading it every single day in a language almost nobody outside the highlands could understand, inside manuscripts fading to illegibility, protected by monks who had no idea that one day a machine would read what their own eyes no longer could. What the AI has revealed so far is, by the estimation of the scholars involved, a fraction of what those manuscripts contain. The scanning is ongoing. More passages are already being flagged. What is waiting in them is, they believe, heavier than what has come out already. The monks of Abba Garima guarded these writings for 2,000 years under one conviction, that the words were meant for a specific moment, a time of spiritual searching, moral confusion, and the collapse of the institutional structures people had built their faith around. They were not wrong about the moment, and they were right that the words would survive long enough to be read again. If something in this video cracked something open for you, leave it in the comments. What hit hardest? The 40-day warnings, the walking death, the cosmological framework that never made it into the Western Bible, or the monks living in poverty on a plateau, guarding words for 20 centuries while the Western Church never once sent anyone to ask what was actually written there. Subscribe, because the Book of Enoch's newly legible passages are next, and what the AI found inside them about the Nephilim, the fallen, the flood account, and the specific verses the New Testament quotes without ever naming its source, makes everything you just watched look like a prologue. The world the monastery was protecting these texts for. It is this one, right now. You are living in it.